Welcome to Novara FM. My name is Richard Hames. The politics of climate change can seem pretty bleak. In order to save the planet, everyone in the global north must seemingly become a little poorer. But that's no longer quite where we're at, if we ever were. Instead of opposing everyone in the global south to the global north, the politics of climate change increasingly pits workers the world over against the owners of capital. And that's not the dogmatic assertion of someone who would believe it to be the case no matter what, but the conclusion of a careful piece of analysis by one of the most wide-ranging thinkers writing today, Ajay Singh Chaudhary. Ajay is the executive director of the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research and the author of The Exhausted of the Earth: Politics in a Burning World. We sat down to talk about exhaustion, stasis, and emergency, how the right got real on climate, and how the left might too. Ajay Singh Chaudhary, welcome to Novara FM.
Richard, thank you for having me.
So about an hour before this interview began, in the spirit of bringing us up to the present moment, I got an email from James Hansen, the climate scientist. And he's writing now, and has been writing for the last few years, about a quite pronounced acceleration.
That's right.
In the degree of warming that there is in the Earth's atmosphere. And he was writing there about aerosols, and about the way in which, in 2020, this is quite a famous story at this point, the Maritime Agency, the International Maritime Authority, decided to reduce the amount of aerosols in marine fuels, the fuels that power boats. And that meant that there were these aerosols, which had previously been suspended in the atmosphere, which had been actually preventing global warming, came down from the sky, fell to Earth, stopped preventing global warming, and therefore accelerated it. And I wanted to just kind of bring us up to date as much as possible, because as you note in the very beginning of the book, the timelines of book publishing are very long.
Yes.
There's a sense that we are always accelerating.
Yes, that's right.
And yet also I want to sort of note that we've been saying we are always accelerating. Things are always going faster. We've been saying this to ourselves
for quite some time.
And yet there's this, on the one hand, a massive sense of speed up, a perennial speed up. In another sense, there's an enormous sense of stasis.
Yes.
And being trapped. And I want to see if you can sort of speak to where we are in terms of the time of climate change. Where are we? When are we?
That's interesting.
In climate change.
I love this question because it kind of starts from where I end a lot of my book, and I am a kind of a windy thinker in many ways. But yes, absolutely. And there's a lot packed into that question. And in fact, there's a lot of debate about how fast is global warming accelerating? Is it? A lot of times there is, some people are very focused on the aberrations that are currently happening because they are very strong. So this aerosol example is great, but I want to come back to that in a second. Other people will say, well, we need a couple of years of data to see if this is just an aberration or if this is in fact the new norm. But speaking, I think, more generally to your point, there's two things that come up. One is, yes, we are in fact accelerating. We are pushing harder. We are doing more. We are throwing more resources to sort of keep the status quo, to keep running in place, right? And this is actually one of the central arguments in especially the sort of heart of the book. Which actually I think slightly departs from some of the most popular debates and the sort of growth versus degrowth and things like that. So I'm much more close with a lot of degrowth thinkers. But one of the reasons I don't particularly use some of those terms and things like that is because this dynamic that you've just described, where we're throwing more resources, moving faster, doing whatever we can to sort of stay afloat, to keep things the way we are, is a different dynamic, right? The growth curves are bending down, and social outcomes are getting quite gnarly, including in very wealthy countries like Britain or the United States. And this sense of stasis, right, is actually, it's one of the dimensions I call exhaustion in the book, where people are like, why are we stuck here? I mean, it's funny because this is the sort of aesthetic stuff that comes in very, very towards the end, but you can even think of this in very sort of light terms, right? It's like, why do I have to watch another Disney Marvel movie again? Like, that's it. Why is that the only thing around? Who asked for this? Like, is this really the way things are? And on the other hand, the other thing that your example brings up is something that is actually really hard to understand, which is risk and uncertainty, right? And this is baked into almost every natural scientific study on climate, but often it translates poorly to those of us who do political or policy work, right? You see a sort of carbon budget and you're like, sweet, so I get to like spend that down to zero. Whereas it's more like asymptotic. And as you approach that limit case, actually you get degrees of uncertainty where it could be cascades, it could be triggers, and then you get just like the true unknown, which could be horrifying. And also with something like the aerosol thing, it's a good example of like, seemed like a good idea, seemed like we should do it. And probably we should do it. In fact, I think it's the right thing to do. But we have to be always taking into account a much broader range of conditions and of possibilities than simply, like turning things on and turning things off. There could be unintended effects. I think this morning, Bill Gates announced he's going to start some solar geoengineering just by himself.
Right. Yes.
And in fact, there doesn't seem to be a regulatory framework to like stop him from doing that. Yeah. And the unintended consequences of something like that could be staggering.
Yeah, that's one of the two other things I wanted to sort of draw out of this aerosols example. We should just say what solar geoengineering is, right? It's a way of putting aerosols, different aerosols, not the ones that come out of
cargo ships.
Yeah, not the ones that come out of those, but different aerosols into the upper stratosphere, so the very highest parts of the atmosphere, in order to do essentially what those aerosols that were coming out of ships were also doing, which is preventing the radiation from first hitting the Earth and therefore preventing it getting trapped in the Earth system, which causes climate change. But also this aerosols thing comes back to one thing that is really difficult about climate change, which is that reducing air pollution in its sort of conventional sense, right? Reducing the amount of air pollution people breathe in cities is an enormous and very important health outcome for people all over the world.
Totally
and yet at the same time, has this deleterious effect at another scale.
I mean, it could. But the example I always think of solar geoengineering is like, it's like, I don't know, bringing an ICBM to like a knife fight or something like that. Yeah, right. It's like, I mean, there's so many things we should be doing. There's so many things we can do. It's sort of this incredible leap into the unknown just to preserve the system that we've got, as opposed to embracing technologies, strategies, and techniques that we have at hand, but that would in fact radically change the economic system, even if it didn't mean that we got like, full communism, full socialism, whatever you want to call it, tomorrow.
Let's sort of see if we can make the case for geoengineering in its sort of capitalist form.
Like why do people like it?
Yeah, so like what? So it seems pretty straightforward why people would want geoengineering to happen, because it seems to, on the surface.
Well, I know why Bill Gates wants it to happen.
Okay, so why does Bill Gates want it to happen?
I mean, Bill Gates wants it to happen because if you did half, even a third of the things that are pretty consensus positions about things that should be done, both in terms of climate mitigation and in terms of climate adaptation, it's going to cost a boatload of money. Yeah. I mean, one of the statistics I cite in my book comes from, I like to cite a lot of non-radical studies that end up saying very radical things. So this is one of those where a couple of economists were studying the brief dip of emissions and stuff during COVID, and noticed that it like basically immediately wiped out 40% of all market cap basically across the entire stock market. And at least I believe it was the US. I don't think it was. But that is most companies trade in the U.S. stock market, right? So we're not only talking about ExxonMobil and Shell. We're also talking about like companies that are far, far away. So we're like think of your fast fashion things like H&M, right? They got a lot in this. Agribusiness has got a lot invested in this, and tech companies. Oh boy, do they have a lot invested in this. And Bill Gates does not want to hear the story where there could be a really good life for the vast majority of people, both the global north and the global south, that just involves energy limitations and redistribution of wealth and energy and resources and things of this nature. Why doesn't he like this? Because that's going to cut into Microsoft profits by like leaps and bounds. And instead, right, solar geoengineering seems like a neat trick, right? Now, it freaks almost anyone who looks at this stuff. I actually read some folks who are really alarmed at this stuff. It looks pretty, like on surface, it seems, I think, intuitive, right? Oh, we're just going to reflect it back up, right? Well, that's what we're going to do, right? But the two most cited problems with this, one is called termination shock. Have you heard this phrase before? Yeah, right. So it's like, once you start doing this, if there's ever like an error in your flight plans, or if like someone shoots down a plane, or if you run out of money or whatever, and so you stop doing the planes, or you get bored, I don't know, Bill dies, or something like that, all of a sudden you get this rebound effect that's even more intense. Sorry, I probably shouldn't snap like that on the radio.
You can snap like that, that's fine.
Like a rebound effect that's even more intense than what you had in the first place. So that's one of the classic dangers. The other one is that we just don't know, right? And a lot of people will be like, is this in fact going to be like inducing like early onset nuclear winter? Is this going to be, affecting crop growth? Is this going to change the way we do collect energy from the sun, which is the principal mode that most people are now embracing for the energy transition?
Yep.
So these kinds of things are what come up with solar geoengineering. But I think more to maybe the interest of what I imagine the interest of many folks here who listen to Novara is that really it's part of a let's keep the world exactly as it is, right? The most important thing about climate politics is to try to recreate our existing world with this sort of, it's not my phrase, a treadmill of production. It comes from James O'Connor, I think.
It was Pastone, but yeah.
Oh, is it Pastone? No,
Maybe,
I think it's O'Connor.
Okay.
Well, whoever it is. Right, but I sort of amp this up usually. I keep this extractive circuit, right? This really vicious cycle where we're doing more and more for less and less return, and that's both social and ecological. And the idea of sort of recreating that, or going through extreme measures, extraordinary technological measures, unproven, uncertain, deeply dangerous, just to hold on to a life that no one seems particularly, other than the Bill Gateses and the Elon Musks of the world, no one seems particularly attached to. Again, I read all these surveys in the book, and I report them, and some of the more recent ones were even more damning, where you get 70-80% of people being like, I don't know what I want the world to be like, but I sure as shit don't want it to be like this.
So that's the politics of exhaustion, to some extent. That's
exactly.
the thing that you write in the book. And the book is called The Exhausted of the Earth, which is a fairly straightforward riff on a Franz Fanon book, The Wretched of the Earth. So I was wondering if we could delve into what was wretchedness, not in the sense that it was something in the past. Because
awesome.
Because it's still with us.
Yeah.
But how do we move from a politics of wretchedness to a politics of exhaustion? And what are the politics of exhaustion? What are its possibilities? Not just as a condition that befalls us or that traps us in a certain way of life, but how do we then use exhaustion as a sort of a tool or a framework for thinking about politics differently?
Oh, thank you. That's a really good question. So Wretched of the Earth, this is probably Fanon's most famous work. There's always debates on Fanon interpretation. I won't get into that stuff right now. In my view, some people debate this. I don't see what grounds they debate this on. Right? He takes it from the verses of the International. Right? Arise, ye regent. Right? Everyone's heard this. Right? And I
thought we were going to get a full performance. I was quite excited for
that.
No.
My voice is too scratchy to sing today. No. And in some ways, right, classic wretchedness, as you said. So if I'm thinking about the International, right, exploitation. This is certainly a part of our world, right? As we all, we, especially in the global north, learned, across, the financial crisis and even earlier, I think, immiseration, right? This classic sort of Marxian category is back on the table. With Fanon, right, there's also the added dimension of the omnipresent or constant prevalence of a kind of direct violence and coercion. And one of the arguments I make in the book is that this, believe it or not, is not only continues to be the case in neo-colonial societies, post-colonial societies across, large swaths of the earth, but is also present in the core, not only in settler colonies like the United States or Canada in their classic ways, but is reaching more and more people, this kind of direct coercion, this kind of direct violence, unmediated violence, right? And unmediated domination and repression. And I think that translates into exhaustion in two or three, well, I won't try to count them, I'll just do them, in several ways, right? So on the first sense, as you mentioned before, right, acceleration is so key to this story. Speed up is so key to this story, right? I will cite a different paper from the same team that I cited last night called Trajectories of the Anthropocene, the Great Acceleration, where they just do basically correlate all of these tremendous accelerations in socioeconomic life with their concomitant ecological effects. So things that seem really distant, right? Foreign direct investment, use of tax havens, I'm trying to think what some of the weirder ones, telecoms, right? All kinds of stuff like this. And you then see all the ways in which this matches various kinds of, ocean acidification, carbon emissions, so on and so forth, right? And this speed up is not only a speed up of ecological destruction, although that is key, right? Part of this speed up is also a social speed up. Part of the social speed up is I don't want to say as much, but is a part of the story of climate change or almost as much, equally as much as things like fossil fuels even, right? The classic example I always use, I'm on the radio, so I'll say what I'm holding in my hand, right? It's my cell phone. But, right, like, why does capital want me, global North middle class worker, to have this thing in my pocket, this little, like, mini supercomputer in my pocket? Why? Because it knows that I will do exactly what I do. I'm going to work a little later. I'm going to work a little harder. And that work is going to result in the profitable movement of dollars from one place to another, right? And in fact, so we have to consider those kinds of things, not simply ancillary effects of our current social and ecological crisis, but in fact, causally interrelated phenomena that are feeding back into each other. And I can give another example if you like. This came up in a talk several days ago at a university. I think people might be familiar with Naomi Klein's adaptation of the concept of disaster capitalism, right? There's some kind of horrible disaster. Maybe it's a wreck. Maybe it is a quote unquote natural disaster, whatever. And of course, a bunch of private firms swoop in, often with the help of the state, right? And use this as the best example in the U.S., one of the best examples in the U.S. is Hurricane Katrina, right? A bunch of people come in and try to basically use this as an opportunity to rebuild and reformulate that cityscape into like a nice new neoliberal urban renewal project, right? And the one thing that I think is missing, I think that's a great argument. I think that's totally true. In the climate case, it can be really weird though, because, right, I'll speak in the voice of capital. I am the personification of capital, right? So like I can make a lot of good money, right? Selling you fossil fuels. I can make a lot of good money selling you a bunch of technologies with built-in forced obsolescence. I can make a lot of money doing all this stuff, and it's going to create all these ecological, as they say, externalities, right? And it's going to lead to ocean acidification in a place like the Philippines. So I write about this in the book. But that's not necessarily bad from my point of view as Mr. Capital, right? Or what does Marx say? Mr. Moneybags, right? Right? Capital Volume 1, right? If I'm Mr. Moneybags, I'm like, oh, sweet. So now there's less fishing and there's less agriculture in the Philippines. The Philippines already is a great labor exporter, right? Remittances are a huge part of its economy. So you're telling me I'm going to get more of these workers who I globally value because they're supposedly pliant and wonderful and all this stuff. So you're telling me I get to make money, and the damage that is done allows me to buy cheap labor and send it all kinds of other places. Well, this is fucking fantastic, right? And all it means is we just got to speed up a little bit more and work a little bit harder.
One of the things that I found most generative and exciting about the book was the way in which you were able to link together different moments like surplus populations, disposability of populations, with optimization of populations, right? So the sense that we are sort of being tweaked in the global north into ever greater, more intense regimes of what you describe at one point as hyperwork, which I think is a really good description. And at the same time, that is actually part of the same circuitry as the immiseration and direct, very violent destruction of people in the global south.
That's correct.
And you have this image of the circuit, the extractive circuit. This is the name of the second chapter. And I was wondering if you could talk to us how you sort of work your way towards an image of the whole. Like, in a previous episode, we had an interview about Frederick Jameson.
Oh,
and for
man.
Frederick Jameson, there's this question of the totality. Right?
Yeah, totality.
The whole of the the social framework, right? How can you see the whole thing simultaneously? What is the conceptual work, but then also what is the political work that mapping out things like the extractive circuit of capital does for us?
Great. Okay. It's funny, yeah, totality. There's a large portion of my brain given over to those old school cats, Adorno and company. Not the part of my brain that usually works with Fanon, which is a lot of what this book is. But yeah, social totality, it's a thing. It's real. I think I made a joke the other day. Socio-ecological totality is even more real. And it can be really daunting. And if you read a lot of climate books, they often start with these like staggering numbers, right? It's like you can't even get your head around it. So what I tried to do there, right, the goal of the chapter is to plug the economy, what we call the economy, what we call the global economy, back into its ecological context, right? Which means, right, taking in serious account, like all the feedback, all the inputs, all the outputs, all the waste products, all the energy use, all the stuff that's kind of left out of chapter 1 of your most Econ 101 textbooks. And this is not actually a very easy task, especially if, even for those of us on the left, right? So a lot of our classic thinking, especially in the North, right, is around like Fordist factory production and things of this nature. Whereas today, again, I'll use my little prop of the cell phone. I'm just holding it up, right? Right, this thing is made in like 83 different countries. It's designed, this one's Google, right? So it's designed in California. It is one of the processors is made in Taiwan. Most of its battery components are mined in the Congo. Final construction is in China, and so on and so forth. But you can hear this story, right? This is globalization, right? The spreading as far and as fast of production dictated by comparative advantage, different technical qualities in different geographies, labor costs, so on and so forth, right? And it's kind of like that. Like there are actually things about that aren't terrible, but a lot of them, especially combined with the other sort of aspect of this production, which is just in time or lean production, you've probably heard these things before, means that these are very taut and very tight. They have to run very fast with very thin margins of error. We've seen a lot of these break down in the past couple of years, right? There were some famous cases during the height of the pandemic. There have been some famous cases of like just the other week, like a ship in the U.S. at the port of Baltimore, just plowing through one of the most famous bridges there, right? So this stuff is like not really working so great, but it is still out there. And the way I try to get into this is by looking at these two, semi-fictional people. They represent real people, right? One of them is I think I describe her as a coder or as an accountant, right? A white collar worker, right? Not the person you usually think of as the wretched of the earth, right? And, globally, if I'm doing her like by the book's numbers, right? She makes a lot more money than most people do in the world. She has a lot of consumption items, access to all kinds of goods and services that people in many other parts of the world do not, even in many other parts of America do not. And she is employing this Filipina expat, right, to like do a lot what used to be called in American radical sociology and things like this, a second shift, right? This kind of assumed feminized labor, right, of the house and of elder care and of child care and so on, of the work of social reproduction, right, what Marxists would call social reproduction. So she's hiring someone else to do this, but it's not like a lot of fun, right? Because what does it do for her that she has this help? It means that her second shift can actually be added on to be a part of her first shift. And in fact, you can find this in both very radical, right, Marxian sort of economic literatures, this idea of sort of consumption that really is actually production. You can also find this in a lot of mainstream economic thought, this idea, right? That like actually to get by in a society like yours or mine, right? Like Britain or the United States, I gotta have one of these. And I need it for work. I need it to always be on, right? If I like go too far away from it, I actually like get anxiety, right? Because I might be missing things. And yeah, if I don't meet those higher levels of, output, of economic output. Let's call it that, because the conversations around productivity can get very complicated and very technical. But let's say I don't meet those targets of economic output, I'm going to be held accountable. So both of these very different people, and now we're also talking about the people doing phone assembly in Shenzhen, we're talking about the slave labor in Congo, right? These are very different things, right? Very different degrees. But the key connection, I would argue, and I do argue in the book, is that they're all experiencing an affective experience or an emotional experience that I would call exhaustion. And this is an extraordinary difference from 100 years ago, from 50 or even 60 years ago, where actually, like that woman, again, I'll start with the Californian, because I do imagine many of the people reading my work are going to be, English-speaking Northerners, right? Part of the thing that's so different about her versus in today's model versus the sort of Fordist model is, let's say she does work for Google. Well, what's good for Google is not necessarily good for her. Now, in the mid-century, what was good for Ford was often good for Ford workers, right? What was good for the United States was good for Ford. So therefore, you're sort of organized into a national subjectivity, right? And in this case, right, what's good for America, like maintaining American hegemony, actually makes her life harder and more miserable. And it's exhausting.
Climate change has often appeared to me as a sort of problem for classical accounts of solidarity. So a classical account of solidarity might go something like, we are all in the same way exploited by capitalism, and therefore we have solidarity of similarity, that we are all exploited by capitalism. And this gets massively stretched at different moments. So
that's right.
I'm thinking of the sort of the classic chant, in our thousands, in our millions, we are all Palestinians. And of course, we are not all Palestinians. And nevertheless, there's something that's supposed to be conjured in that chant. And what climate change seems to do to that situation is make those disparities even greater. So I have essentially no material connection to someone in, say, the Sahel, which is a region like somewhere in Western Africa, in West Africa, above the coast but below the Sahara. Right? It's a very fragile region from an ecological standpoint, and it's also a politically fragile region because it contains lots of fairly weak states and lots of fairly complex
There's also
kind of
competing
societies.
land claims.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah. So I have sort of almost no material connection, and yet everything that I do as a global North consumer, the flights that I go on, immediately and imminently destroy their conditions of life.
Yeah.
And so the problem that I have with that, sort of politically speaking, is in some ways that it means that I almost have to fall back into the regime of charitable giving, right? Where my interests don't really align. This is how I would have thought about this, a few weeks back. And then I read your book.
I hope I disabused you of that.
You did, precisely. Right. So you make this claim that there is actually a global realignment of the objective, to use that slightly sort of
I'm fine. It's cool.
Conditions of people in the global South who are not necessarily workers or proletarians in the sort of classical
form. We're talking about informal, we're talking about peasants, we're talking about lumpenproles.
Right.
Yeah.
And so people and you make this claim that there is an alignment increasingly between workers in the global North and these people in sort of
there could be. And there
should be. Right. Yeah. And that project of connection, that project of making that explicit is a sort of the urgent political task of our moment, and building those international organizations. Can you speak to how those objective interests have become aligned?
A lot of theories of solidarity do, in fact, seem to come out of this kind of sense of a moral feeling, like, oh, Richard, you look like we have, I don't know, something in common, or I just feel for you. And it's really quite funny. I'm not a Marxologist. I like a lot of folks who are. I don't always think I'll be doing some events with, I think, the person who does this stuff best, which is Kohei Saito, later in the year. But so I don't always cite Marx chapter and verse on everything. But he is pretty what's the word? Vitriolic on this kind of philanthropic socialism, which of course in his era, was often from well-meaning aristocrats who are oh, let's do some nice bread and kitchens and public services for the poor, and then they'll be happy and this kind of thing. Right. And that kind of argument from sympathy or argument from charity, I think is pretty weak. And this does, in fact, get us into some dicey places because, right, there are a lot of folks who I really respect, some people I love in the climate space, who are very focused on things like the Loss and Damage Fund, right? Yep. And for listeners who don't know what that is, right, the Loss and Damage Fund is part of the various treaty frameworks that have been set up around climate. It is woefully underfunded. It's supposed to be this large sort of pool of money from wealthy nations like the United States, like the United Kingdom, and much of Europe, to pay into a fund that will then pay out to nations in the global south to sort of leapfrog or jump over sort of dirty development into a cleaner, sustainable development ideal, some kind of circular economy, whatever term you want to use, right? And the reason I don't focus on that so much in my book is I just don't think anyone's ever going to do it. I don't think people are, I mean, your prime minister now is Rishi Sunak, right? Your next one's likely to be Keir Starmer, it seems like. I don't see either of those cats being real hepped up about putting, hundreds of billions of pounds into some fund for, Bangladesh, for the Democratic Republic of Congo, or for South Africa.
Unless it's done in the traditional form of aid, which is to simply
to like stimulate market. Yeah. No, absolutely. And part of the story of the extractive circuit to me is, as leftists, as Marxists, we have been talking for a long time about internationalism. And there were some really good grounds for internationalism in the past, and we've missed a lot of them. Some of our greatest catastrophes as leftists, so I'd say cite World War I as one of the principal examples of this, are the failures of internationalism, right? So the famous story for socialists, right, is that every socialist party said, we're not going to fight your stupid bourgeois war. And then, of course, all but I think the Bolsheviks and the Italians do fight your terrible bourgeois war. So this has always been a problem. But part of the sort of weird, and I don't want to sound like I'm some kind of crazy, like classic acceleration, but part of the weirdness of neoliberalism, which is a crisis management political regime to reestablish profitability from the crises of the 1970s, is that it has obliterated a lot of those classical forms that kept North and South divided, that made it in the rank, boring, as you said, objective, material interest for me as a global North worker to look and be like, I have nothing to say, or I have nothing in common with this person in Bangladesh or in Uzbekistan or in Madagascar or Mozambique, right? I'm just rattling off things, right? But today, in fact, I do. And it's not just this very abstract sense of ecology, right? That we all need water and we all need air, we definitely need food to eat and all this kind of crap, right? I mean, those things are important. Don't get me wrong, kids. But instead, right, it is the fact that actually, and I think this is really as an American, I'll really focus on America right now for a moment, right? Right now, the United States is, as a government and as an empire, is standing in the way of things that would make the material lives of the vast majority of Americans much better, and would also make lives better across lower and middle income countries in the name of preserving U.S. hegemony, right? And U.S. hegemony is I think I'll go back to my two characters, right? For my Californian coder and the Filipina sort of gig worker, right? Actually, U.S. hegemony sucks for them. It doesn't actually pay off super well for them. And in quantitative terms, I talk about this in the book, but then you get into qualitative terms, right? Wouldn't you like to have a 4-day work week? Wouldn't you like to have time to make healthy food, access to healthy food, right? Seasonality, all this kind of stuff that sounds so hippy-dippy is now, I mean, the rich get that. Why shouldn't the poor get that? It's like all these things that we know are better and healthier and that survey data shows people want. In fact, what stands in the way of a lot of that is, of course, there is, of course, domestic politics and intransigence, but it is this also sort of desperate fight for global hegemony, and as opposed to just relenting, pulling back just a little bit and saying, all right, we're not gonna, the U.S. is not and will not be the corner of global green tech production. That ship already sailed. It's in China, and the idea that like protectionism to stimulate new industrial activity in the United States is good for most Americans is belied by the reality of these programs. So I'll use a very concrete example. The CHIPS Act, which was Biden's other big program, anti-China sort of stimulus program. I don't know how else to call these things. Yep. Ended up with Samsung getting a bunch of tax breaks, so they're not going to pay taxes, and they're going to have union-free factories located in Texas, where in fact their labor laws are so low, wages are so low, et cetera, that it is globally competitive. Yep. If you throw in a little bit of that, tax-free and all this kind of stuff. And from an ecological point of view, you're like, I'm going to start building all this like new stuff, and I'm going to be seizing like these solar panels over here. Other people who are much more focused on this than me would point out, you can't like there's only so many solar panels you can make. Like we're gonna run some real limits on this stuff. It's ecologically destructive. This is also part of the argument for why sovereignty in the global south is now a northern interest for an average person, right? Those kinds of limits, the costs that will arise there, should and would be borne by firms and by states and not necessarily by your average person.
It's related to what you sketch out in the book as the Rex position about the relationship between US hegemony as a strategy or a sort of national interest and large-scale fossil fuel infrastructure. This crucially, so the Rex is the Rex Tillerson, former CEO of ExxonMobil, and then briefly the
he only lasted for like 9 months or something.
Really not that long. But
I mean, he did. He went in and got the deals he wanted, and then he like got out of Dodge as fast. He was like, "This shit sucks. I'm out of here."
But he's also very emblematic in some ways.
He's a smart guy.
Yeah, and he's a great figure to pin lots of things on because, as you point out in the book, he's not a climate denialist.
No, not at all.
And so denialism is no longer the issue, at least at the top of politics. I would argue that there is still a lot of residual confusion, and certainly that sort of sowing of confusion is part of the right-wing playbook about climate realism.
Course,
but this is part of what you describe as right-wing climate realism. And I was wondering if you could give us a sort of an overview of what that position is, because it's not climate denial.
Yes.
It's sort of moved on from that, but nevertheless, it still has lots of that residue. It still has lots of those sort of dynamics inside it.
Right-wing climate realism is in many ways the first intervention I try to make in my writing on climate, which is simply that, there was a time when the United States is the world's center of climate denial. Go USA, right? But even in the U.S., it is now absolute climate skepticism. And I think you're right to schematize this. And my favorite author on that question is Carrie Marie Norgard, who studied this in Norway, the petrostate everyone forgets about, right? And what she notices, right, is there's very few climate skeptics there. And she, actually, I can't remember all her terms, unfortunately, at the moment, but it's in the book, people, if you want to read it, because there's sort of like a sort of skeptical euphemism, which is the sort of like climate like version of like collateral damage. And then there's this kind of functional denialism, right? And she talks about all those things. But actually, when I talk about right-wing climate realism, this is just very straightforward. As I say, someone like Rex looks at the spreadsheets that I look at, right? He's downloaded the data sets, right? From the IPCC, from the authors, like from the papers that go into these things. He's looking at it and he's like, okay, so if we, and often the assumption in climate policy is that it's like zero or everything, right? But actually what a lot of the right is doing around climate is in fact like, okay, so yeah, if we go up to maybe delta 4, right? Change an increase of 4 Celsius over industrial baseline, that, that's real bad, but maybe we can like stall it out there. A lot of economists, so very famously, William Nordhaus argued for a change in 3.5. Now, if you say this stuff to people who work on this closely and who are not alarmists, who are not apocalyptic thinkers, they're like, whoa, that is some bad shit. Like here's the million bad things that happen at that degree. And right-wing climate realism, I actually think, is the dominant form of right-wing engagement with climate stuff. And I think the reason why it can be confusing is that you do have your Trumps, right? You do have, who says it's a Chinese hoax, right? It's this sort of like communist conspiracy, climate change. I don't think very many people believe that, but whatever. But the people he works for, right? The sectors of capital that support that kind of stuff in the US, they're very serious about climate, but not in the way that maybe you or I are. They're serious about a mode of climate where they're like, oh, so you're telling me 1 billion people die and there's going to be all these refugees, but I can probably hold out with the right weapons. And like, actually some parts of Russia and some parts of Canada will be a little bit better. Like, and they're like, and I get to keep, I don't have to wipe out, a huge portion of my wealth and give up a huge portion of my power, in the next 5 years. Instead, I get to keep that stuff in perpetuity, and the socio-ecological conditions that we've locked in make it very unlikely that there can be more popular sort of reaction against this kind of regime. So that seems like a gamble that's worth it. And so when I talk about right-wing climate realism, I'm talking about things like that. So this kind of slower, more methodical, more calm pace. And in fact, Rex Hazel, I quote Rex on this. He's like, why are you guys in such a hurry on this energy transition? Why are you so obsessive? Like, chill out, you fucking hippies, right? Like, the other thing he says is, right, if I want to make money, and if I have to drill to make money, I'm going to drill to make money. And there's been a bunch of books about this. You don't need to read me for this. Renewables will not have the return that fossil capital gives us, right? For very obvious reasons. And also, I do agree with all the natural scientific thinkers and social scientific environmental researchers that some sufficiency levels probably need to be set, some caps, at least for the short term, because that's what we're talking about right now.
What are the obvious reasons? You said that they won't have the same returns for obvious reasons. And I feel they may not be obvious to everyone.
So let's say I sell you a photovoltaic array, right?
Please.
It works pretty much out the box, right? You do need some, there's some good labor. Like people who talk about climate jobs, I often try to get them to talk about climate jobs that aren't just I'm a burly person who like installs things, but there's a lot of that needs to be done. There's a lot of building that needs to be done. But we should also be talking about shifting our economies to more socially convivial, let's say, arrangements. But nonetheless, right? So I sell you a photovoltaic array. That's I make a little bit of money on that. That's all right. Maybe it requires maintenance. Maybe it requires, fixing things here and there. Maybe I have to replace it at some point, right? But that's pretty much the economic activity around that. Other than that, it's right. Capturing energy from the sun. It's either going into some kind of battery storage, or it's even going at some kind of like physical storage, right? These kind of interesting uses of like heating up rocks or elevation things, all kinds of fun, weird ways in which people have tried to solve these problems. But compare that now to fossil fuel infrastructure. I initially have a huge debt, right? Which is the investment I have made in my, offshore oil platform, and then in pipelines and things like this. But some of these things can be sold. Some of these things get subsidized. In fact, the U.S. subsidizes quite a bit of oil production, and the United States is the world's largest oil producer
by some mile. Yes.
So I make money there, right? I make some money there. I also make some debt there, and debt can be useful. But of course, I then sell you the oil or the liquid natural gas or whatever. I just sell it to you over and over every day in, day out. And this, that commodity exchange, right? I'm not selling you light. I'm not selling you air, but I'm selling you oil. Yep. And oil I can make money on all the time.
Right. So this is sort of one of the most transparently perverse aspects of the way that capitalism functions.
Oh, yeah.
Right, which is that the fact that solar panels are easier and require less maintenance, and in some ways have less maintenance labor that needs to go into them, means that they are economically less productive.
Absolutely.
And therefore, there is so you want something complicated, difficult to maintain, that's a good commodity.
Yeah.
Something that is simple, not a good commodity.
The other thing I want to say about right-wing climate realism that's closer to the way I talk about it in the book, although this is one of the ways I do. There's a lot of econ in the book, so I apologize. But the other way I talk about it is that, when we look at these sort of ever increasingly intensive border regimes, these ever increasingly intensive surveillance regimes, these ever increasingly intensive, use of militarized violence, including here in the imperial core. All of a sudden, I view these as climate policies. I don't think that these are, in fact, sort of separate things. You talked about social totality before, right? That it can just be pulled away from the story. Because if I'm going to do moderate mitigation, and I'm going to do adaptation that's focused mostly on preserving wealth and power, and those who seek safe harbor with wealth and power. Those kinds of maneuvers, as distasteful as they might be, right? They might make you feel discomfited. They make me feel that way. But right, they're perfectly reasonable. They're perfectly rational. And I said before, I wanted to come back to your thing about the right. What was, can you do the chant again? The Palestine
we
chant?
are in our thousands, in our millions. We are all Palestinians.
Yeah, it's. I want to say it's beautiful, but I don't mean this in a salutary sense. It's well put, is what I mean. Because in fact, that like one of the things that we've seen in this current moment, right? This book came out well before this current moment, or it came out during this current moment, but was written obviously, before it. Is in fact a growing realization amongst many people that what is happening in Palestine. So there is, I think, I've actually been to like 12 or 15 of these student encampments now. So there's intense, the highest level of Palestine solidarity I've experienced my entire life. But also a growing sense, I've listened to a lot of student speeches, I've listened to a lot of people talk about this, that people see themselves in what is happening in Gaza and throughout the historic land of Palestine. And I don't want to get in trouble, to say this at Novara, but I know there was some controversy, right? Like, Arabistani was on here saying something like, oh, some of these people identifying with Gaza are going too far. Some other folks that are similar to people I critique in the center of the book being like, I don't know why anyone who's not Jewish or not Palestinian gives a fuck about this issue. And this kind of punching left thing, in addition to sort of helping the police state and all this kind of stuff, right? Seems to miss the part of the solidaristic moment where people are like, we are all Palestinians. This is the world for the world's disposable populations. This is the plan for organized abandonment. And I did say this yesterday, but I'm happy to repeat it again. A lot of the technology. So in the United States, I can't speak to Britain, unfortunately, because I don't know the details as well. But in the United States, where I was watching cops the other day beat up students who are doing Palestine solidarity protests and encampments and things of this nature, at many of which I heard these exact kind of arguments connecting to climate, connecting to labor. One of the encampments I was at in New York, they invited all of the union locals to do their meetings at the encampment. It's almost the exact opposite of the image. They're like, do your classes here. Let's actually have a free university. Let's actually bring the unions in. Let's actually do it, right? When people say we are all Palestinians, I don't think it's just this empty charitable. I think there is a moral strength to it. But also it is the recognition, and Gustavo Petro in Colombia made this comment, I think, similarly several months ago, right? This recognition that, oh, this is what they want to do to us, right? And this is why in the United States, NYPD and LAPD train with the IDF. This is why some of the same companies that do surveillance in the Congo also work with Israeli tech and surveillance firms. And also those are the same companies doing labor surveillance in places like Canada and the United States. Like, I'm sorry, it is all interconnected in a globalized, highly accelerated economic world. And there are opportunities in there too. And this moment is very vital for that. And I think it's a major error for some on the left to sort of be like, ooh, I don't want to touch that. I want to get away from that. When in fact, that is in many ways the kinds of solidarity that at least I was imagining. I have other very concrete examples in the book of various different parts of the world and coalitions that build. But if we're speaking in a grand sort of abstract sense, those are some of the broadest solidarities that one would hope for as part of a radical emancipatory climate politics in this moment.
Yeah, just to say that listeners who are interested particularly in that sort of global circulation between America and Palestine should check out Palestine as Showroom, interviewed with Anthony Lowenstein, with Rivka Brown. You're very careful to not go into this idea that climate change will be this sort of relentless apocalypse, sort of Mad Max. And yet I can't help but, well, okay, so yeah. But yeah, I want to suggest that there's something in the political imaginary that we've just sketched out there that is actually, and probably does deserve the name ecofascism or climate barbarism or something like this. Right? Like, so what, are you pulling back from that as well? Or is it just that we can actually not go so far with climate change and still get the extreme political effects
Oh,
that
no.
we might also be worried about.
One of the reasons I try, this is interesting because, like, right, I have spent the last so long of my life, long period of my life, doing all this natural scientific work, trying to synthesize it with political theory, right? And various other things as well. But before that, one of the things I studied most closely was religion in many different forms. And there's so much eschatological, right, talk around climate. Did you see this movie? It was, I don't know if it was only US only. It's called Don't Look Up.
Yes.
It was on, I think,
We saw it.
A dreadful movie. And the reason why it is dreadful is it's exactly this apocalyptic mode, right? It's coming in the future. So error number one, right? Climate change is already here. You're living through it. You feel like there's a lot of social instability. You feel like there's a lot of like new weird diseases. You see that the crops are failing. You see the inland hurricanes and weird like change of the Gulf Stream and shit like this. It's already happening, right? It's been happening for a long time. So error number one, it's already happening. Error number two, there's not going to be one quick moment where like the sky falls and you're like, I see it. The climate, it has changed, right? That's never going to happen. And three, right, it is also this kind of, there's almost something like, this is maybe gets a little psychoanalytic, and that's not my best area, but like, there's almost like something tempting and something like comforting about like, you look back to like some of the accounts of like the Black Death here in Europe, and like some people were like, well, finally, like some peasants were like, finally, at least it's going to get the aristocrats too. Like, at least we're all going to die and we're all going to be equal. And the sad truth is, look, at some degree of and I use climate change as a catch-all. So at some degree of global warming, at some degree of acidification, at some degree of biodiversity loss, at some degree of all these various, planetary boundaries, right? You would in fact have, absolute existential levels.
Like 5 or 6 degrees. I think.
Yeah, 5 or 6 or higher. You're toast. And it might not just be global warming. Again, that's why I include those other examples. There can be a kind of carbon tunnel vision that focuses only on greenhouse gas and not other things. Whatever, it doesn't matter.
Which is why the sort of politics of geoengineering are so strange.
Oh, yeah.
Because they are just exemplifying.
And they're just hardcore
fixation.
Focused on one issue and not on these others, even if they did work. And, the joke I always make about tech in my book and elsewhere is like, if someone, like, I'm not anti-tech. Like, I just like to work with tech that works. I don't fetishize tech. I come from, my family are a lot of mostly scientists and engineers. Pretty gung-ho in this stuff. But also it makes me pretty skeptical. I smell bullshit, and there's a lot of bullshit out there. And the joke I always make in the book around tech is like, if someone's keeping nuclear fusion like in their back pocket, I wish they would stop like hiding it from the world, because we could use some of that shit right now. Because nuclear fission is really hard to make, takes like a decade, takes all this upfront material costs, which everyone erases by using fun statistical tricks, by being like over 100-year life scale. It's like the most efficient thing ever. Mm-hmm. But you're like, but I'm most concerned about the next 10 years, the next 20 years, right? The point being, yes, of course, there's some level at which apocalypse, again, I don't even like to use the word. Let's call it collapse, social collapse, is going to happen. And in fact, people will argue about what degrees. Like, what do I even mean by social collapse? Do I mean the collapse of the global economy? Do I mean the end of civilized life? I mean, whatever. But the truth is, when I'm looking at what we call business as usual scenarios, or if I'm looking at the existing nationally determined commitments of various countries, existing firm level and state level policies, we are looking not at the nothing versus everything argument, but again, this sort of ties back to the earlier bit. We're looking at the slow, methodical, and risky, but like a good bet if you're a rich guy, way of doing things, right-wing climate realism. And that runs all the way up to, in my thinking, ecofascism, climate apartheid, climate barbarism, all that stuff. I think that's very real. In fact, here in Europe, I think is one of the places you see it most strongly, these kind of green-black alliances and things like this, where it's like, good, clean living for good, clean people, right? That kind of thing, right? But what we're not usually actually talking about, people being like, yeah, fuck it, let's go for Delta 7, right? We're mostly dealing with the Delta 3.5 people versus the people who are like technically it's feasible to probably still hold to at least maybe 1.5, maybe 1.6, right? But certainly below 2 or something like that. If we do everything we can starting now, and if we can build the political will, we've got the tools, we've got much of the knowledge, and what we don't have is the power to make it happen.
Let's sort of get back to this this question of left strategy, which is sort of set up as a collection of oppositions between degrowth on the one hand and what is called eco-modernism, and particularly eco-socialism. Eco-socialist modernism.
I've never heard eco-socialism.
Oh, socialist eco-modernism. It's just just like the left. I don't know if I'm scrambling the right kind of like.
That's fine. Yeah,
the left-wing version of eco-modernism, and you have a lot to say about this in the book, and
I do.
I want to kind of get into that debate a little bit. Earlier, you mentioned that to some extent that debate is not correctly set up, right? It's not like there is a sort of a strict opposition between a politics of less and a politics of like endlessly more.
But
you actually paint a much more convincing, for my money, convincing portrait a bit later when you talk about the minor utopia. The minor paradise.
It's a concept I borrowed from one of my colleagues, Rebecca Ariel Port, so I want to give her credit. Yeah.
Tell us about the minor paradise and how it sort of skirts away from these sort of false oppositions as far as I can see.
I mean, the joke I always say about eco-modernism is it's a very funny phrase because it's neither ecological, it's not particularly ecological, nor is it particularly modernist. Because to me, modernism is not just synonymous with modernization, right? Modernism is exciting. It's like new ideas, it's experiments. I'm playing a little fast between categories, but modernist is experimental literature. Like modernism is like cool new rad buildings that we never thought about. Modernism is also like, I heard this in the book, like you have all these versions of like post-colonial modernism that never really got off the ground, where people are like, oh my God, let's imagine what we can do in our newly free decolonized space. And it's this, and it's not just like a bunch of like, let's go back into the ye olden times, right? It's often these really exciting, cool things. And then sometimes the degrowth, and like I'm a little bit kinder on the degrowth folks because I respect that they actually engage with the material, with like the material realities. I have like several critiques of that in the book of what I see as a limitation, because I do think that the sort of really laser focus on growth can sometimes take us off the ball, or what sport metaphor works better here?
Eyes on the ball.
Eyes on the ball. If that works. Yeah. It take your eye off the ball of profits, right? There's also some like, if this was like a classroom, I would like tear up little bits of paper and throw them around the room and be like, theoretically, that's money. Congratulations. We've just increased growth, right? So it doesn't always mean the thing we mean. And also we often then miss what is the actual general trend, even with large growing economies like in places like China, India. Overall global aggregate growth is just bending down. And that's just a sort of fact. And we're throwing more and more at that lower growth curve to achieve high profits in increasingly difficult conditions. And when I get to the minor paradise, this is almost as funny because it's, I talk a lot about emotions in the book, right? And, it's not a natural disaster when you know that it's because of someone's bottom line. And when you shift on that front, you get very angry. And I think that kind of anger is politically useful. It's also politically dicey, right? Because that can go in any number. It's inchoate, is what I say, right? It can go in a number of directions. But one of the things that is, in fact, I seldom am accused of being optimistic, but I have been accused many times talking about this book of being very optimistic in these sections, because in these sections, I have the old Marxist admonition not to do cookshops of the future, right? I'm not going to give you my, Charles Fourier version of like an eco monastery that's made of glass or whatever, like a phalanstery, right? But what I do talk about are all the ways when you translate these gray climate policy sort of ideas that are very much in tune with the scientific consensus, a lot of the ways you can translate that are into this kind of really exciting, experiments and projects in things like social housing and urban planning. You see a lot of the necessity of socialized social services that are state-run or publicly provisioned. This is because it's simply more efficient, and efficiency matters a lot in ecological things. I even talk about things like, I think we mentioned can't remember if we're on camera or if it was before the show, right? Synthetic aviation fuels, right? These aren't real. I keep taking pictures on my train, on this trip. Every time I see one, it's like, you're on a net zero flight, or like, this flight will be net zero by 2027. And I'm like, bullshit, motherfucker. That ain't true. Right. But instead, we could be, if people had more time, a little more power, a little more social stability, a little more security in their life, then they could have the time to travel by ship, by train, I even float blimps in there, because there is this new excitement. Certain sectors of capital are trying to get in. And I think this is important for us on the left to recognize, if we're not going to have a revolution, which doesn't seem likely in the next 5 to 10 years, that there are some sectors of capital that one can work with. And one of them are some of these companies doing this kind of stuff, and you have to keep it under control. But yes, the minor paradise, as I use it, borrowing Rebecca's phrase, it is all of these abandoned roads not taken. It's all these possibilities that we're avoiding so we can do the Bill Gates thing, which is keep things exactly like they are. And I do spend a large part, the center of the book, critiquing people on the left who also hold this very strange, what I view as a very conservative position, which is that the chief task of climate politics on the left is to restart and kickstart further capital accumulation, instead of actually doing, class warfare, instead of actually being like, we're going to start having a greater say in social surplus and redistribution, and in fact be, especially us in the North, right? In the South, a lot of the development stuff is still quite an imperative. So the way in which a lot of scholars will talk about this today is, in order to make that space for the South, there has to be pulling back in the North. But this doesn't mean grace dystopian. In fact, I go through, I think you talked about earlier, right? I go through in the book, like, the numbers version of this, where it's like, I'm like, your income's better, your health is better, your access to services is better, your housing is better. You're like, well, this is real nice. But here's the qualitative difference, right? Here's here's the great foods you can have. Here's the cool clothes you can have. Here's the arts you can have. And not just like some kind of like, oh, we're all going to go back to like strumming ukuleles, right? Or whatever, right? But you can even talk about arts in the digital space, arts in I talk briefly, but I'm thinking about it a lot because I think I'm going to write about it soon. Like video games, right? Just like phones, like a PlayStation or something like this, it has tremendous energy and resource inputs into it. And if you talk to the engineers, you talk to the designers, you talk to the people who are most intimate, like the workers, right? The people most intimately involved with the software side. Now, the hardware side, they're also like, yeah, please slow the fuck down. But on the software side, they're like, we don't need that much more teraflops. Like, we don't need this much power, right? We don't need this. And this is actually stifling creativity. So this is actually where I get to some of those dimensions of aesthetic exhaustion, and being like, here is all the stuff that keeping the machine on, keeping bigger, faster, better, more, right? Just makes my life and almost everyone else's life total misery, and makes us exhausted in all these different ways. And it holds, right? And there's people we can blame. So that's a politics, right? That's literally it, right? There's basically a division, bifurcation. It's looser than Marx's, which is one of the reasons I lean on Fanon, who literally has that phrase, stretching Marx, right? But also there's around, like, right, I don't talk about future a lot in the book, or horizons. In the present right now, we could be doing things and living a life that is so much more dramatically reasonable, restful, exciting, and dynamic, but also relieving of that kind of vicious cycle of exhaustion that is devastating us both socially and ecologically.
I have a huge number of more questions, but in the spirit perhaps of rest, respite, relaxation, and recreation, as at one point in the book, I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap up there. Thank you so much for joining us, Ajay Singh Chaudhary. Thank you.
Thank you.
Support independent journalism and set up a regular donation to Novara Media from just £1 a month. Head to novara.media/support, or face the consequences.